The candles in the drawing room had barely been lit when the shouting began, and Eleanor Hartwell felt her stomach tighten before she even understood the words. Rain tapped lightly against the tall windows, and somewhere down the corridor a clock chimed the hour, its sound swallowed almost immediately by the rising tension filling the room around her. She was standing near the far wall, half hidden behind a tall vase of white lilies, exactly where she always stood at gatherings like this. No one looked at her. No one ever did. She was the poor cousin, the quiet companion, the woman who fetched shawls and refilled teacups and disappeared into the background like a piece of furniture that had learned to walk. But tonight was different, and she knew it the moment the foreign guests arrived. Duke Alexander Ashworth stood at the center of the room, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back in the practiced stillness of a man trying very hard not to look desperate. He was, Eleanor knew, exactly that. Desperate. The negotiation that had been arranged for weeks, the one meant to secure a trade agreement that could save half the county from ruin, was falling apart before it had even properly begun. His translator, a thin, nervous man named Edmund Price, had taken ill that very afternoon. A fever, the housekeeper said, something eaten at the inn. Whatever the cause, the man was upstairs sweating through his sheets while downstairs, 3 foreign dignitaries stood waiting with growing impatience, speaking rapidly to one another in a language none of the household understood. Except Eleanor understood every word. She stood very still, listening, her heart beating fast. The tallest of the 3 men, a broad-shouldered official with silver hair, turned to his companions and said something sharp, something dismissive. He was talking about the Duke. He was saying that the English were disorganized, that this whole visit had been a waste of good travel, that perhaps they should simply leave before the evening was wasted entirely. Eleanor's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. She had learned the language as a child, in a house far from here, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. Her father had been a diplomat once, before everything fell apart, before the debts and the scandal and the slow collapse of everything her family had built. He used to bring her with him to meetings just like this one, teaching her to listen, to translate, to understand not just words but meaning. She had learned 7 languages before she turned 16. Then her father died, and the money disappeared with him, and she was sent to live with relatives, who saw her only as a useful pair of hands. No one in this room knew any of that. No one had asked. The Duke was pacing now, speaking to his steward in low, urgent tones, trying to find some solution before the guests lost patience entirely. Eleanor watched him from her corner. He was younger than she expected a duke to be, with dark hair that fell slightly out of place, and an expression that suggested he was more comfortable managing estates than managing people. He looked, in that moment, entirely out of his depth. The silver-haired official said something else, something cutting, about how the young duke clearly did not take this meeting seriously enough to prepare properly. His companions laughed quietly. Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest, an old and familiar frustration, the kind she had felt 100 times before when people spoke freely in front of her because they assumed she could not understand a single word. She could always understand. She simply never said so. Tonight, something in her hesitated. If she stayed quiet, the negotiation would collapse. The Duke would lose whatever this agreement was meant to secure, and the county families who depended on it would suffer for it. She thought of the tenant farmers she had heard the housekeeper mention, families who needed this trade deal to survive the coming winter. She thought of her own life, invisible and unheard for so long, and wondered if speaking now would change anything at all, or simply draw attention she did not want. The Duke turned, running a hand through his hair, looking for anyone in the room who might have an answer. His eyes swept past the guests, past his steward, past the nervous housekeeper hovering by the door. They landed, for just a moment, on Eleanor. She looked down immediately, the way she always did. A companion did not meet a duke's eyes. A companion did not exist, not really, not in rooms like this. But the silver-haired official spoke again, louder this time, clearly losing his patience, and Eleanor heard the words before she could stop herself from understanding them. He said that they would give the Duke exactly 1 more minute before they called for their carriage. 1 minute. Eleanor thought of her father's voice, calm and steady, teaching her long ago that words were bridges, and that someone always had to be brave enough to build them. She thought of the tenant families. She thought of every year she had spent making herself smaller so that no one would notice her, would need her, would depend on her only to abandon her later. She stepped forward. It was such a small movement, barely a step, but in a room this tense, it drew attention immediately. The housekeeper's eyes widened. The steward frowned. The Duke turned toward her, his expression somewhere between confusion and irritation, as if wondering why the quiet companion had suddenly decided to involve herself in matters far above her station. Eleanor's voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "Your Grace," she said. "He said you have 1 minute before they leave." The room went silent. The Duke stared at her as though she had spoken in riddles. "I beg your pardon?" "The gentleman in silver," Eleanor continued, forcing herself to keep her chin up, to not shrink back into the wall the way every instinct told her to. "He said this negotiation has already wasted their evening. He gave you 1 minute." The silver-haired official's eyes snapped toward her, sharp with sudden understanding. His companions exchanged startled glances. Clearly none of them had expected the quiet young woman in the corner to understand a single word they had been saying. The Duke's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "You speak their language?" Eleanor swallowed. There was no going back now. "Yes, Your Grace." For a moment, nobody moved. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence. Then the Duke, with the instinct of a man who had spent his whole life learning to seize opportunity when it appeared, closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. "Then help me," he said, low and urgent. "Please. I am about to lose everything this meeting was meant to secure." Eleanor's heart pounded. She had spent years disappearing, years making herself invisible so that no one would ask anything of her, so that no one could disappoint her the way her family once had. And now the most powerful man in the room was asking for her help, in front of everyone, with nowhere left to hide. She thought of the farmers again. She thought of her father's calm voice. She thought, for reasons she could not quite explain even to herself, that perhaps it was time to stop hiding. "Tell them," she said quietly, "that you apologize for the delay, and that what you have to offer is worth every minute of their patience." The Duke did not hesitate. He repeated her words in English, watching her carefully as she translated them, watching the silver-haired official's expression soften just slightly at the sincerity in the Duke's voice. It was, Eleanor realized with a strange flutter in her chest, the first time in years that anyone had truly needed her for something more than fetching shawls or refilling teacups. The negotiation was far from finished. In fact, the hardest part had not yet begun. But for the first time that evening, there was a small flicker of hope in the room, and it had come from the woman no one had ever bothered to notice. The Duke turned fully toward her now, his eyes searching her face as though seeing her for the very first time. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Hartwell." He nodded slowly, as if committing it carefully to memory, as if understanding, even in that first strange moment, that everything in his household was about to change because of the quiet woman standing in the corner. Outside, the carriage that had nearly carried the foreign delegation away sat waiting in the drive, its horses restless in the cold evening air. Inside, for the first time in years, Eleanor Hartwell stood in the center of the room instead of its shadows, and she did not step back. The steward, a stout man named George Whitfield, cleared his throat and looked between Eleanor and the Duke with open confusion. He had known her for 3 years as the quiet companion who managed the linens and copied letters in a careful hand. He had never once heard her speak more than a few polite words at dinner. Now she stood beside the Duke, translating with the calm confidence of someone who had done this her entire life, and George found himself staring as though a familiar painting had suddenly come to life. The silver-haired official, whose name Eleanor now understood to be Minister Voss, studied her with narrowed eyes. He asked, in his own language, how a companion in an English household came to speak his tongue so fluently. It was not a hostile question, merely a curious one, but Eleanor felt the weight of it all the same. She hesitated only a moment before answering him directly, in his own language, without waiting for the Duke to prompt her. She explained, briefly, that her father had once served in the diplomatic service and had taught her from childhood. Minister Voss's eyebrows rose slightly at her fluency, and something like respect flickered across his stern features. The Duke watched this exchange with growing astonishment. He understood none of the words being spoken, yet he could read the shift in the room as clearly as if it were written in English. The tension that had filled the drawing room only minutes before was beginning, slowly, to ease. "What did he say?" the Duke asked quietly. "He asked how I learned his language," Eleanor said. "I told him the truth." The Duke studied her for a long moment, as though trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the quiet shadow he had walked past 100 times without a second glance. "There is clearly more to you than anyone in this house has ever bothered to notice, Miss Hartwell." Eleanor said nothing, though something in her chest tightened at the words. She had spent so long being overlooked that kindness, even small and simple kindness, felt unfamiliar and almost dangerous. Minister Voss cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the matter at hand. He spoke again, this time at greater length, outlining the terms his delegation had come to discuss. Eleanor translated carefully, choosing her words with precision, softening nothing but losing nothing either. The Duke listened intently, nodding along, occasionally glancing at her as though checking that she was truly managing all of this as effortlessly as she appeared to be. By the time the guests finally seated themselves for the evening's discussion, the atmosphere in the room had changed entirely. The threat of an early departure had passed. In its place was something far more valuable, a fragile thread of possibility, that the negotiation might actually succeed. And at the center of it, unnoticed by no one now, stood Eleanor Hartwell, translating not just words, but the fate of an entire evening, one careful sentence at a time. The negotiation resumed at the long table in the drawing room, papers spread out beneath the candlelight, and within minutes, it became clear just how badly things had already gone wrong before Eleanor stepped in. Documents drafted by Edmund Price, the ailing translator, contained several careless errors, phrases that meant one thing in English and something entirely different, and far less flattering, in the delegation's own language. Minister Voss had clearly read those documents before arriving. His earlier irritation, Eleanor now understood, was not simply impatience. It was insult. She caught it almost immediately, halfway through the first exchange, when Minister Voss referenced a clause about shipping rights and his tone turned cold and clipped. The Duke, unaware of the subtext, continued speaking warmly, trying to build goodwill, completely missing the growing offense on the other side of the table. Eleanor's mind raced. She could translate the minister's words exactly as spoken, which would embarrass the Duke publicly and likely end the negotiation before it truly began. Or she could find a way to bridge the gap, to soften what needed softening, without changing the meaning, without betraying either side. She chose carefully. Minister Voss says the shipping clause as written is unclear, she said aloud, though what he had actually said carried a much sharper edge, something closer to an accusation that the English had tried to disguise unfavorable terms behind clumsy language. He would like it clarified before proceeding. The Duke nodded, relieved. Of course. Please tell him we are happy to revise it together, line by line, until both parties are satisfied. Eleanor translated this faithfully, watching Minister Voss's shoulders ease slightly at the sincerity in the Duke's tone. It was working, barely, but it was working. For the next hour, Eleanor moved carefully between two languages and two very different ways of thinking, catching misunderstandings before they became insults, catching insults before they became disasters. She noticed the small things nobody else in the room seemed to notice, the way Minister Voss's youngest companion, a quieter man named Advisor Reiner, kept glancing nervously at a folded letter in his coat pocket, as though it contained something he was not yet ready to reveal. She noticed the way the Duke's hands tightened slightly on the table whenever the conversation turned toward money, a small tell that suggested his finances were far more precarious than his composed manner let on. None of this was her business, she reminded herself. She was only meant to translate words, not read rooms, not study the private worries hidden behind careful expressions. And yet she could not seem to stop herself from noticing everything, the way she always had, the way her father had once taught her to notice everything. Because in diplomacy, he used to say, the truth was rarely spoken aloud. It was hidden in silences, in glances, in the space between words. Midway through the discussion, the true crisis arrived. Advisor Reiner finally withdrew the folded letter from his coat and passed it across the table to Minister Voss, who read it with a deepening frown before sliding it toward the Duke. It was written entirely in their language, dense with formal phrasing, and the Duke stared at it helplessly before turning to Eleanor. What does it say? Eleanor took the letter, scanning it quickly, and felt her stomach drop. It was a formal notice, drafted before the delegation had even left their own country, threatening to withdraw from any agreement entirely if certain terms were not met by the end of the evening. Terms that were, as far as Eleanor could tell, far harsher than anything previously discussed. It read almost like a trap, prepared in advance regardless of how the meeting unfolded. She hesitated only a moment before translating it fully and honestly, sentence by sentence, watching the color drain slightly from the Duke's face as he understood the position he had truly been placed in. This was no longer a simple negotiation. It had, perhaps from the very beginning, been designed to fail unless the Duke agreed to terms that would badly damage his estate and everyone who depended upon it. The room fell into a heavy, uncertain silence. The Duke set the letter down slowly, his jaw tightening, and Eleanor watched him gather himself, watched the desperate young man from earlier that evening transform, slowly, into someone steadier, someone determined not to be cornered without a fight. "Tell Minister Voss," he said quietly, "that I understand the terms as written. And tell him that I refuse to be threatened into signing away the livelihoods of people who have nothing to do with this negotiation." Eleanor translated the words exactly, watching Minister Voss's expression shift from cold expectation to something more careful, more measured. He had not expected resistance. Clearly, he had expected the Duke, faced with such pressure, to simply agree. What followed was the most delicate hour Eleanor had ever navigated in her life. The Duke, with her voice carrying every word between them, began countering point by point, offering alternatives, refusing to be rushed, refusing to be intimidated, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding the negotiation from its damaged foundation. Eleanor found herself doing more than simply translating. She began, carefully, suggesting phrasing that might land better, warning the Duke quietly when a particular tone might cause offense, guiding him through cultural nuances that no one else in the room understood. At one point, when the Duke proposed a compromise regarding shipping fees, Eleanor noticed Advisor Reiner's expression flicker with something like relief, quickly hidden. She leaned close to the Duke and murmured, low enough that only he could hear. "The younger advisor wants this to succeed," she whispered. "I believe he disagrees with how harsh the letter was. Address him directly. It may help." The Duke glanced at her, surprised, then nodded, and did exactly that, turning his next remarks toward Advisor Reiner, with warmth and respect. The young advisor's posture eased visibly, and for the first time that evening, he spoke up in support of a compromise, gently urging Minister Voss to reconsider the harshest terms. It was, Eleanor realized with quiet astonishment, working. Hours passed. Candles burned low. The tense formality of the evening slowly gave way to something more human, more collaborative, built sentence by sentence, concession by concession, until finally, close to midnight, Minister Voss set down his pen and extended his hand across the table. "We have an agreement," Eleanor translated, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. The Duke shook the minister's hand firmly, relief flooding his face, and for a brief, unguarded moment, he turned to Eleanor, with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Genuine, open admiration. "You saved this evening," he said quietly, once the guests had begun gathering their things. "More than that, I believe you saved a great deal more than this evening alone." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away, unused to being seen so clearly, so completely, after years of being nothing more than a shadow in the corner of every room she entered. "I only translated words, Your Grace," she said softly. "No," the Duke said, his voice quiet but certain. "You translated far more than that." As the delegation's carriage finally pulled away into the cold night, the Duke remained standing at the window long after the sound of hooves had faded, his thoughts no longer occupied by trade agreements or shipping fees, but by the quiet woman who had spent years standing unnoticed in the corners of his own household, and who had just proven herself the most valuable person in the entire room. News of what had happened in the drawing room spread through the household by morning, though not in the way Eleanor expected. The servants whispered about it in the kitchen, some with admiration, others with the particular suspicion reserved for anyone who rises too quickly above their station. Eleanor heard fragments of it as she passed through the corridors, phrases half caught, glances that lingered a moment too long. She kept her head down and her pace steady, the way she always had, though something in her chest felt different now, lighter and heavier all at once. The Duke sent for her before noon. She found him in his study, a room she had passed 100 times but never once entered, surrounded by shelves of ledgers and maps and the quiet clutter of a man who carried the weight of an entire estate on his shoulders. He rose when she entered, which surprised her more than anything else that had happened the night before. Dukes did not rise for companions. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "please, sit." She sat carefully at the edge of the chair across from his desk, hands folded in her lap, unsure what to expect. Gratitude, perhaps, a small reward, a polite dismissal back to her usual duties now that the crisis had passed. Instead, the Duke studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I made inquiries this morning, about your father." Eleanor's spine stiffened slightly. "Your Grace?" "Edmund Hartwell," the Duke said, diplomatic attaché, served abroad for nearly 15 years before he returned to England. "I remember hearing his name once, years ago, spoken with great respect." He paused. "I did not connect it to you until this morning." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had not spoken of her father in years, not truly, Not to anyone who might actually understand what his name had once meant before everything collapsed. He died when I was 17, she said quietly. There were debts, difficulties I did not fully understand at the time. My mother had already passed, and there was no one else to take me in except my aunt and uncle. And they have kept you as a companion ever since, the Duke said, not quite a question. They gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go, Eleanor said carefully, the old habit of loyalty rising automatically, even though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The Duke's expression suggested he understood exactly how much truth lived beneath that careful sentence, and exactly how much had been left unsaid. He did not press further, though Eleanor could tell he wanted to. You saved this house a great deal of trouble last night, he said instead. More than trouble. That agreement will keep dozens of tenant families working through the winter. Without it, I would have had very difficult decisions to make regarding the estate's finances, decisions that would have cost people their homes. Eleanor looked down at her hands. I only spoke the words that needed speaking, Your Grace. You did far more than that, the Duke said. You read the room in ways I could not. You noticed things I never would have noticed on my own. That is not a small skill, Miss Hartwell. That is rare. She did not know how to respond to praise, genuine praise, offered without any expectation attached to it. She had spent so many years being useful in ways that were expected and unacknowledged that sincere recognition felt almost foreign, almost uncomfortable, like a garment cut for someone else's shoulders. I would like your help again, the Duke continued. There are further meetings planned with Minister Voss's delegation in the coming weeks, details still to be finalized. I would consider it a great favor if you would continue as translator, formally this time, with proper compensation for your time. Eleanor's breath caught. Compensation, formal recognition. It was more than she had dared hope for in years, more than her aunt and uncle had ever offered her beyond room and board in exchange for endless unpaid labor. I would be honored, Your Grace, she said, and meant it completely. The Duke smiled, a small, genuine thing that transformed his usually composed face into something younger, something more open. Then it is settled. And please, when we are not in company, you may call me Alexander. After what you accomplished last night, formality feels rather unnecessary between us. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks again, that same unfamiliar warmth from the night before. That would not be proper, Your Grace. Perhaps not, he agreed, but I find I would like it all the same. Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself spending more time in the Duke's company than she ever had in her entire time living under her aunt and uncle's roof. She helped draft correspondence in 3 different languages. She sat in on smaller meetings, offering insight not just on translation, but on the subtle currents of diplomacy her father had once taught her to read. The Duke began seeking her opinion on matters entirely unrelated to language, asking what she thought of certain tenant proposals, certain investment decisions, certain letters that required careful, delicate phrasing. She found, to her quiet astonishment, that he actually listened to her answers. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, being seen. For years she had made herself small, had learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, had learned that her own opinions were rarely wanted, and even less rarely welcomed. The Duke's household operated differently. He asked questions and waited for real answers. He noticed when she was tired. He remembered small details about her. The way she preferred her tea without sugar. The way she always paused thoughtfully before answering difficult questions. The way her expression changed subtly when she was troubled by something she did not wish to say aloud. One afternoon, walking together through the gardens while discussing an upcoming meeting, the Duke asked her, quite suddenly, what she had wanted for herself before her father's death changed everything. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. I wanted to work in the diplomatic service, as my father had. It seemed impossible for a woman, even then, but I dreamed of it all the same, traveling, meeting people from different corners of the world, understanding them, truly understanding them, not just their words but their hearts.
And now?
The Duke asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated, surprised by how much the question unsettled her. She had not allowed herself to want anything in so long, had trained herself so thoroughly to accept whatever small scraps of purpose came her way, that imagining a future of her own choosing felt almost frightening. I do not know anymore, she admitted honestly. I stopped allowing myself to want things a long time ago. It was easier that way. The Duke stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious in a way she had not seen before. That seems a very sad way to live, Miss Hartwell. It was safer, she said simply. Safety and living are not always the same thing, he said, and something in his tone made her look up and meet his eyes properly for the first time. Really meet them. without immediately looking away the way years of habit demanded she should. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The garden around them was quiet except for the distant sound of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the hedges. Eleanor felt something shift between them in that silence, something she did not yet have words for, something that frightened her slightly with how much she wanted to lean into it rather than retreat. It was the Duke who finally broke the silence, clearing his throat and stepping back, as though he too had felt the moment stretch further than either of them intended. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not mean to overstep." "You did not," Eleanor said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of it. They continued walking, the conversation turning back to safer, more practical matters, but something had changed between them, something neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both of them carried quietly for the rest of that day, and for many days afterward. It was her aunt, Margaret Hartwell by marriage, who first noticed the change in Eleanor's manner, the new lightness in her step, the way she seemed to disappear for longer stretches of the afternoon than her usual duties required. Margaret said nothing at first, only watched with narrowed, calculating eyes, the way she watched everything that might disrupt the comfortable arrangement she had built around her niece's quiet, unpaid usefulness. But watching, Eleanor would soon learn, was only the beginning. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a footman who had ridden hard from the Duke's estate, and Eleanor knew from the state of the seal alone that something had gone wrong. She broke it open in the privacy of the small room she shared with her cousin, reading quickly, her stomach sinking with every line. The Duke wrote that a second meeting with Minister Voss's delegation had been moved forward unexpectedly, only 3 days away instead of 3 weeks, and that he needed her there without fail. She folded the letter carefully and went to find her aunt, only to discover that her aunt had already read it first. Margaret Hartwell stood in the small parlor with the letter's outer envelope in her hand, her expression carefully composed into something that might have passed, to anyone who did not know her well, as simple curiosity. Eleanor knew better. She had lived under this woman's roof for 6 years, had learned every shade of her aunt's moods, every flicker of calculation behind her polite smiles. "The Duke writes to you rather frequently these days," Margaret said, her voice light, deceptively casual. "He requires a translator for his diplomatic affairs," Eleanor said carefully. "I have been assisting him, as we discussed." "Assisting," Margaret repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it lacking. "You disappear for hours at a time. You return with new gowns you did not have the funds to purchase yourself. The other servants talk, Eleanor. They wonder what exactly a duke wants from a companion he summons so often, alone, without a chaperone." Heat rose in Eleanor's face, a mixture of embarrassment and anger she rarely allowed herself to show. "Nothing improper has occurred between us. I have only ever served as his translator, exactly as he requested." "Perhaps," Margaret said, setting the envelope down with deliberate slowness. "But perception matters a great deal in society, my dear, particularly for a woman with no fortune and no family name worth mentioning. If word spreads that you have been seen too often, too privately, in the Duke's company, it will not be the Duke's reputation that suffers for it." Eleanor felt the familiar tightness return to her chest, the old instinct to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller so as not to cause trouble. But something had changed in her these past weeks, some quiet strength she had not known she still possessed, and she found herself standing straighter instead of smaller. "I have done nothing to be ashamed of," she said firmly, "and I intend to answer the Duke's letter as requested." Margaret's expression hardened, the mask of casual concern slipping away entirely. "You forget yourself, Eleanor. You live in this house on our charity. You eat at our table, sleep under our roof, because we chose to take in your father's debts along with his daughter, when no one else would. The least you owe us is discretion and obedience, particularly when your behavior threatens to embarrass this family." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land, striking at every old wound Eleanor carried, every year of feeling like a burden tolerated rather than a person valued. But this time, something in her refused to bend the way it always had before. "I have worked for this family for 6 years without wages, without complaint, without ever once asking for more than what I was given," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly but steady in its conviction. "I have earned the right to accept honest work when it is offered to me." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "We shall see what your uncle thinks of that." Her uncle, William Hartwell, proved less direct than his wife, but no less determined to control the situation. He summoned Eleanor to his study that evening, his manner stern and disapproving, and informed her in no uncertain terms that continuing to work so closely with the Duke would not be permitted, not without proper safeguards in place, safeguards that conveniently required significant compensation, paid directly to William himself, rather than to Eleanor. Eleanor left the study that night with her stomach twisted into knots, understanding at last the true nature of her family's concern. It was never truly about propriety or reputation. It was about control, about the fear of losing the free labor and quiet convenience Eleanor had provided for years without complaint. If she became independent, if the Duke paid her directly and treated her as valuable in her own right, her aunt and uncle stood to lose everything they had quietly built on the back of her invisible service. She wrote back to the Duke that night anyway, agreeing to attend the meeting as requested, though she said nothing of the confrontation that had taken place in her uncle's study. Some instinct told her to keep that particular battle private, at least for now. The days leading up to the meeting proved difficult in ways Eleanor had not anticipated. Small obstacles appeared constantly, her aunt suddenly requiring her assistance with tasks that had never mattered before, her uncle insisting she accompany relatives on errands that conveniently overlapped with the times she needed to prepare her notes for the negotiation. It felt, increasingly, like a quiet campaign designed to exhaust her, to wear down her resolve through 1,000 small interruptions rather than open confrontation. Worse still were the whispers that began circulating through the wider social circle her aunt moved within. Eleanor first heard the rumor from her cousin, a younger and gentler soul named Beatrice, who reported it with obvious discomfort one evening while helping Eleanor prepare for bed. "They are saying," Beatrice whispered, "that you have set your sights on the Duke deliberately, that you learned languages specifically to make yourself useful to wealthy men, that you engineered the entire situation with the sick translator to place yourself in his path." Eleanor felt sick at the accusation, so thoroughly divorced from the truth that it almost would have been laughable if it were not causing such real damage. "That is not what happened, Beatrice. You know that is not what happened." "I know," Beatrice said softly, "but others do not, and rumors travel faster than truth ever does." The rumor reached the Duke faster than Eleanor expected. He mentioned it carefully during their next private meeting, his expression troubled, watching her reaction closely. "Someone suggested to me today that your assistance has not been entirely selfless," he said, "that you have been positioning yourself deliberately, hoping to secure my attention through calculated means." Eleanor's heart sank, though she forced herself to remain composed. "And what did you say in response, Your Grace?" The Duke hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. "I told them the accusation seemed unlikely," he said carefully. "But I confess, the timing troubled me. It occurred to me how quickly this arrangement developed, how conveniently your skills appeared exactly when I needed them most." Eleanor stared at him, stunned and hurt in equal measure. "You believe I orchestrated Edmund Price's illness? That I somehow arranged for a man's fever in order to insert myself into your affairs?" "I did not say that," the Duke replied quickly, though his tone lacked its usual certainty. "But you must understand the position I am in, Miss Hartwell. My household, my reputation, the trust of everyone who depends upon this estate, all of it rests on decisions I make carefully, not decisions made in haste based on feelings I do not fully understand." The word feelings hung in the air between them, unspoken until that moment, and Eleanor felt her chest tighten with a painful mixture of hope and hurt. Whatever had been growing quietly between them these past weeks, he had just named it aloud, only to immediately retreat from it in the same breath. "I have given you nothing but honesty since the night we met," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the ache building behind her eyes. "If you believe otherwise, then perhaps you never truly saw me at all, Your Grace. Perhaps I was only ever useful to you, the way I have been useful to everyone else in my life, valued only for what I could provide rather than who I actually am." She left his study before he could respond, her hands trembling as she walked the long corridor back toward the carriage waiting to return her home. She did not cry, not yet, though the effort of holding herself together cost her more than she cared to admit. That night, alone in her small room, Eleanor allowed herself to finally feel the full weight of everything that had happened these past weeks. The hope she had allowed herself to feel, the quiet dream of being seen and valued for who she truly was, rather than what she could offer, all of it felt suddenly fragile, suddenly foolish, exactly as she had always feared it would be. She thought of her father's voice again, calm and steady, and wondered what he would have told her now. Perhaps that trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. Perhaps that the Duke's hesitation was born of fear rather than true doubt. Or perhaps, the darker voice in her mind whispered, that she had simply allowed herself to hope for something that had never truly been meant for a woman like her. A woman with no fortune, no family name, Nothing to offer the world except a mind full of languages no one had ever cared to notice until it became convenient for them to do so. Whatever the truth, one thing had become clear. The negotiation in 3 days would proceed with or without the trust between them fully restored, and Eleanor would have to decide, quietly and alone, whether she was willing to help him again after everything that had just been said. The morning of the second meeting arrived cold and overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain, and Eleanor dressed slowly, her hands steadier than her heart. She had spent the last 3 days turning the Duke's words over and over in her mind, the hurt of them still sharp, but beneath the hurt sat something more important, something she could not ignore. The Tennant family still depended on this agreement. Whatever had broken between herself and the Duke personally, the larger stakes had not changed, and she refused to let her own wounded pride cost innocent people their livelihoods. She arrived at the estate exactly on time, her expression composed into careful neutrality, and found the drawing room already tense with a different kind of trouble than before. This time the danger did not come from Minister Voss, who greeted her with something approaching genuine warmth, clearly having grown to respect her these past weeks. The danger came instead from an unexpected guest, a neighboring lord named Edmund Falworth, who had somehow inserted himself into the proceedings under the guise of offering the Duke friendly counsel. Eleanor disliked him immediately, though she could not yet say precisely why. He had a smooth, practiced charm about him, the kind that felt calculated rather than natural, and his eyes lingered on the documents spread across the table with an attention that seemed far too keen for a man who claimed no direct interest in the negotiation. The meeting began cordially enough, but within the first half hour, Eleanor noticed something troubling. Lord Falworth had brought with him a document, supposedly a translated summary of the previous agreement's terms, prepared, he claimed, by a scholar of his own acquaintance, to help the Duke better understand the fine print, before finalizing anything further. Eleanor asked to see it, and the moment she began reading, her blood ran cold. The document was riddled with deliberate mistranslations, subtle enough that anyone without genuine fluency would never notice, but damning all the same. Certain clauses had been twisted to suggest the Duke was securing far greater concessions than he actually was, while other passages implied Minister Voss's delegation had agreed to terms they had never actually accepted. If the Duke referenced this false document in front of the delegation, believing it accurate, the entire negotiation would collapse in outrage and accusations of bad faith, exactly as it had nearly collapsed on the very first night, only this time with no simple explanation to repair the damage. She understood immediately what was happening. Lord Falworth wanted the negotiation to fail, whether from old rivalry, financial jealousy, or some deeper scheme Eleanor did not yet understand. He had crafted a trap designed to embarrass the Duke publicly and destroy the fragile trust it had taken weeks to build. The Duke, unaware, reached for the document, preparing to reference it during the discussion, and Eleanor felt panic rise sharp and sudden in her chest. She had every reason, after their last conversation, to simply let this happen. He had questioned her honesty, questioned her motives, wounded her in a way that still ached beneath her careful composure. A smaller, more bitter part of her whispered that perhaps he deserved to face the consequences of trusting the wrong advisor for once. But that was not who she was, and she refused to become someone smaller than herself simply because she had been hurt. "Your Grace," she said quietly, before he could speak the false terms aloud, "may I examine that document more closely before you proceed? I want to ensure the translation is accurate." The Duke glanced at her, surprised by the request, but nodded and passed it across. Lord Falworth's smooth expression flickered, just slightly, a crack in his composed mask that confirmed everything Eleanor already suspected. She read through it slowly, deliberately, giving herself time to think, and then looked up at the room with calm, steady resolve. "This document," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "contains significant errors. Several clauses have been mistranslated in ways that misrepresent both parties' positions." Minister Voss's eyebrows rose sharply. Errors, or something more deliberate? Eleanor met Lord Falworth's eyes directly, refusing to look away even as his expression hardened into something colder, more dangerous. "I cannot say with certainty who prepared this document or why, but the pattern of these mistranslations does not read as simple carelessness. Each error consistently favors misunderstanding rather than clarity, and each one, if acted upon, would have caused this negotiation to collapse in accusations neither side actually earned." The room fell into stunned silence. The Duke's gaze snapped toward Lord Falworth, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. "You provided this document, Falworth. You claimed it was accurate. I merely passed along what my scholar prepared, Lord Falworth said quickly, though his composure had begun visibly cracking under the weight of every eye now turned toward him. "I have no reason to doubt his work." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said, her voice still calm but edged now with quiet steel, "your scholar would care to explain why this document translates the phrase for reasonable compensation as the phrase for total forfeiture. That is not an error a genuine scholar of this language would make. That is a deliberate choice." Minister Voss, who understood enough fragments of English to follow the accusation even before Eleanor fully translated it, turned his sharp gaze on Lord Falworth with open suspicion. "Is this true? Were we meant to be deceived here today?" Lord Falworth's charming mask finally slipped entirely, revealing something colder and more calculating beneath. "This negotiation should never have proceeded this far," he said, abandoning pretense entirely now that his scheme had unraveled. "The Duke's estate cannot sustain the terms being discussed. I merely hope to spare everyone the trouble of discovering that failure themselves." "That was not your decision to make," the Duke said, his voice low and furious in a way Eleanor had never heard from him before. "And it was certainly not your place to deceive a foreign delegation under my own roof, risking not just my reputation, but the safety of every agreement England hopes to build with their nation in the future." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. The Duke, with Eleanor translating every word precisely and honestly this time, explained the full situation to Minister Voss, apologizing for the deception and requesting time to review the original terms properly, free from any further interference. Minister Voss, though clearly displeased by the attempted manipulation, seemed genuinely reassured by the transparency of the Duke's response, and more than that, by Eleanor's own integrity in exposing the deception rather than allowing it to proceed unchecked. Lord Falworth was escorted from the estate within the hour, his reputation among the assembled witnesses thoroughly and permanently damaged. Once the immediate crisis had passed and the delegation had retired to rest before continuing negotiations the following day, the Duke found Eleanor alone in the empty drawing room, gathering her notes with hands that had finally begun to tremble now that the danger had passed. "You could have let that happen," he said quietly, watching her from the doorway. "After what I said to you 3 days ago, you had every reason to let that document destroy everything." Eleanor did not look up immediately, focusing instead on straightening the papers before her, needing the small task to steady herself before facing him directly. "I did not do it for you," she said finally. "I did it for everyone who depends on this agreement succeeding. The tenant families, Minister Voss's own people, who deserve honest dealing regardless of what happens between us personally." "Eleanor," the Duke said, and something in the way he said her name, quiet and raw, made her finally look up and meet his eyes. "I was wrong. Wrong to doubt you, wrong to let fear and rumor cloud what I already knew to be true in my heart. You have shown me nothing but honesty and courage since the moment we met, and I repaid that with suspicion born of my own uncertainty, rather than anything you actually did. You embarrassed me in front of people whose opinions I have spent my whole life trying not to need," Eleanor said, her voice tight with old hurt. "You made me feel, for just a moment, as though I would always be nothing more than a convenient tool for other people's purposes, no matter how much I gave." "I know," the Duke said softly, crossing the room to stand before her, "and I cannot undo what I said, but I can tell you, plainly and honestly, that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, Eleanor Hartwell, and that whatever fear made me doubt you 3 days ago has no place in what I actually feel." Eleanor's breath caught, her carefully guarded composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of everything she had held back these past difficult days. "And what is it you feel, Your Grace?" The Duke reached for her hand, hesitant, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not. "I feel," he said quietly, "that I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who valued my title far more than they valued me, and that you, from the very first night, saw past all of it to something real. I feel that I have never once, in all these years, wanted so badly to be worthy of someone's trust." Eleanor felt tears finally rise, unbidden, at the raw honesty in his voice, at the vulnerability of a man who had spent his whole life guarding himself carefully, finally choosing to lower his defenses completely. "I want to trust you again," she said softly. "But trust takes time to rebuild, Alexander. It cannot simply be spoken back into existence." "Then I will earn it," he said simply, his hand tightening gently around hers, "for as long as it takes. I am not going anywhere, Eleanor, not this time." Outside, the rain that had threatened all morning finally began to fall, soft and steady against the windows, and inside the quiet drawing room, something fragile and precious began, slowly and carefully, to rebuild itself between them. The final negotiation session took place 3 days later, and this time there was no crisis waiting to unravel it. Minister Voss arrived with genuine warmth in his manner, greeting Eleanor first, before even acknowledging the Duke, a small gesture that spoke volumes about how thoroughly she had earned his respect over the preceding weeks. The agreement was finalized without incident, terms fair to both sides, built on the kind of careful trust that only honest dealing could produce. When the delegation's carriage finally departed for the last time, Minister Voss paused at the door and turned back toward Eleanor with an expression of genuine admiration. "Miss Hartwell," he said, in his own language, watching her translate for the benefit of the household staff gathered nearby. "My country has need of skilled diplomats who understand not just words, but people. Should you ever wish for a position within our service, you would be welcomed." Eleanor felt a flush of pride at the offer, the first professional recognition of her skills she had ever received from anyone outside this household, and she thanked him sincerely, though something in her chest already knew, with quiet certainty, where her heart truly wished to remain. The Duke watched this exchange with an unreadable expression, and once the carriage had disappeared down the long drive, he turned to her with something like nervousness written across his usually composed features. "You could leave," he said quietly. "Build the life your father always dreamed for you." Minister Voss clearly meant what he said. "I know," Eleanor said simply. "Would you consider it?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment, watching the vulnerability in his expression, the genuine fear beneath the question, and felt something settle warmly in her chest. "I have spent my entire life being valued only for what I could provide to others," she said slowly. "My aunt and uncle valued my labor. Society valued my silence. Even you, in your worst moment of doubt, briefly valued only my usefulness rather than trusting who I truly was." The Duke flinched slightly at this, though he did not look away. "But these past weeks," Eleanor continued, "you have also shown me something I never expected to find. You listened when I spoke. You asked what I wanted, rather than assuming you already knew. You were wrong once, and you owned that wrong completely, without excuse, without deflecting the blame onto me instead. That matters more to me than any position Minister Voss could offer." "Eleanor," the Duke said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to hide, "I am not offering you a position. I am asking you to stay because I cannot imagine my life continuing well without you in it." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of raised voices interrupted them from the direction of the front drive, and both turned to see an unwelcome and familiar carriage pulling to a stop. Margaret and William Hartwell emerged, Margaret's face already tight with fury, clearly having heard rumors of the successful negotiation, and Eleanor's growing closeness with the Duke, and having decided the time had come to reassert control before it slipped entirely beyond her reach. "Eleanor," Margaret called sharply, striding across the drive without waiting to be announced. "We have come to bring you home. This arrangement has gone on quite long enough." The Duke stepped forward slightly, positioning himself, without quite realizing he was doing it, in a manner that suggested protection rather than mere courtesy. "Mrs. Hartwell, your niece is a grown woman, fully capable of making her own decisions regarding her employment." "Employment," Margaret repeated, her voice sharp with scorn. "Is that what we are calling it now? A young unmarried woman spending countless hours alone in a Duke's company, accepting gifts, accepting wages that rightfully belong to the family who raised her these past 6 years." "I was given a home," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the anger building beneath her calm exterior. "Not raised with love, not treated as family, but tolerated in exchange for labor I provided willingly and without complaint for 6 long years. I owe you nothing further, Aunt Margaret." Margaret's face flushed red with fury, and William stepped forward, his tone attempting reason where his wife's had failed. "Eleanor, be reasonable. Think of your reputation. Think of what people will say." "I have spent my entire life thinking of what people will say," Eleanor replied, and something in her voice made even the Duke turn to look at her with quiet awe. "I have made myself small, made myself quiet, made myself invisible, all so that no one would ever have cause to speak ill of me. And in all those years of careful silence, I was still poor, still unwanted, still treated as a burden rather than a person. I would rather be spoken of honestly now, as a woman who chose her own path, than continue disappearing simply to avoid gossip that will find fault with me regardless of what I do." The Duke, watching this exchange, finally stepped fully to her side, his presence a quiet but unmistakable show of solidarity. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying the full authority of his title now, cool and unmistakably final. Miss Hartwell has served this estate with distinction and honesty these past weeks, skills that saved this household a significant diplomatic and financial disaster. She will be compensated fairly and directly for that service, and she is welcome to remain under my household's protection for as long as she wishes, free from any further obligation to either of you." William's face paled slightly at the implied threat beneath the Duke's polite words, understanding clearly that opposing a Duke publicly would cost his family far more than it could ever gain. Margaret, however, was not so easily deterred. "This is precisely the scandal I warned you of," she hissed at Eleanor. "A Duke defending a penniless companion so publicly. People will talk, Eleanor. They will say terrible things." "Let them," Eleanor said simply, and for the first time in her entire life, she meant it completely. Margaret opened her mouth to argue further, but the Duke spoke first, his tone leaving no further room for discussion. "I believe this conversation has concluded. Miss Hartwell will contact you regarding her belongings at her own convenience. Good day." The Hartwells departed in tense, furious silence, their carriage disappearing down the drive far less triumphantly than it had arrived. Eleanor watched them go, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for 6 long years. A weight she had carried so long she had almost forgotten what its absence might feel like. "Are you well?" the Duke asked quietly, once the carriage had vanished from sight. "I believe," Eleanor said slowly, testing the truth of the words as she spoke them, "that I am better than I have been in a very long time." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the autumn afternoon settling gently around them, before the Duke turned to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious in a way that made Eleanor's heart quicken. "I meant what I said earlier," he said, "about not being able to imagine my life continuing well without you. I have spent these past weeks watching you navigate impossible situations with more grace and courage than I possess myself, watching you fight for people who never once fought for you, watching you choose honesty even when silence would have been so much easier. I do not simply need a translator, Eleanor. I need you." Eleanor felt tears rise, unbidden and unguarded, at the raw sincerity in his voice. "Alexander," she said softly, "I have spent my whole life being needed for what I could provide. I do not know if I would recognize being loved for simply who I am." "Then let me show you," he said quietly, reaching for her hand once more, this time with none of the hesitation from before. "For as long as it takes. There is no negotiation here, Eleanor. No terms to be carefully translated or softened. Only the plainest truth I have ever spoken. I love you. Not the woman who saves my negotiations, though I am endlessly grateful for that woman too, but the woman who stood in a corner for years, unnoticed and unheard, and never once stopped being remarkable." Eleanor felt something inside her finally break open completely, years of careful guardedness giving way at last to something warm and certain and entirely her own. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue, words she had never once expected to speak to anyone, let alone a Duke who had once overlooked her as thoroughly as everyone else in her life had. "I have, I think, for longer than I dared admit even to myself." The Duke smiled, the same open, transformed smile she had first glimpsed weeks ago in his study, and drew her gently closer. "Then marry me," he said. "Not because I need a translator, though I confess I will happily keep you as mine for the rest of our lives. Marry me because I cannot imagine facing anything this world offers without you at my side." Eleanor laughed through her tears, a sound of pure disbelieving joy she had not allowed herself in years. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." News of their engagement spread through the county within days, carrying with it, exactly as Margaret had predicted, a great deal of talk. But the talk, to Eleanor's quiet surprise, proved far kinder than she had feared. Minister Voss sent formal congratulations from abroad, praising the match publicly in diplomatic circles as proof that true skill and character mattered more than birth or fortune. The tenant families, who understood better than anyone what Eleanor's quiet courage had secured for their futures, welcomed her warmly whenever she visited the estate's grounds. Even some of the household staff, who had once whispered suspicion in the kitchens, now spoke of her with something closer to quiet pride. Not everyone approved, of course. There would always be those who whispered about fortune hunters and scandal, who could not accept that a duke might choose character over connections, competence over inherited status. But Eleanor found, for the first time in her life, that such whispers no longer held the power to make her small. On the morning of her wedding, standing in a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, Eleanor caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Not because she looked different, though she did, her posture straighter, her eyes brighter than they had been in years. She barely recognized herself because for the first time since her father's death, she looked like a woman who believed, completely and without doubt, that she deserved every good thing standing before her. Alexander waited for her at the end of the aisle, and as she walked toward him, past faces both familiar and new, past a life that had once made her invisible, and now, finally, saw her completely, Eleanor thought of her father, and hoped, somewhere, he was proud of the woman his quiet lessons had helped her become. They exchanged their vows in English, simple and plain, though Alexander had quietly requested that a portion be spoken in the language that had first brought them together, a small tribute to the night everything between them had begun. Eleanor spoke the words steadily, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel, 7 languages living inside her, and finally, at long last, every single one of them heard. A year passed, and life at the Ashworth estate settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Alexander had quite dared to imagine during those tense early weeks of negotiation and doubt. Eleanor no longer stood quietly in corners, waiting to be useful only when someone remembered she existed. She sat now at the head of the estate's correspondence table, managing not just translation but a growing web of diplomatic relationships that her husband had come to rely upon, as thoroughly as he relied upon his own steward. Minister Voss wrote to her personally twice a year, sharing news of his country's affairs, occasionally seeking her counsel on matters involving English customs and expectations. What had begun as a desperate emergency on a single tense evening had grown into something neither of them could have predicted, a genuine and lasting friendship between two people who had first faced each other across a table thick with misunderstanding. It was in the autumn of that first married year that trouble arrived again, though this time it came wearing a far more familiar face than any foreign delegation or scheming neighbor. Edmund Price, the very translator whose illness had first opened the door for Eleanor's quiet talents to be discovered, returned to the estate seeking employment once more, having fully recovered from the fever that nearly cost him his position all those months ago. Alexander, ever generous, considered reinstating him in some capacity, feeling a genuine debt of gratitude toward the man whose absence had inadvertently changed both their lives so completely. But Eleanor, reviewing Price's old papers one quiet afternoon, while organizing the estate's records, discovered something troubling buried among his previous correspondence. Letters, carefully worded but unmistakable in their meaning, revealed that Price had once accepted payment from a rival trading house to delay negotiations deliberately, stalling English interests just long enough for a competing agreement to be secured elsewhere. His illness on that fateful night, Eleanor realized with growing unease, may not have been entirely accidental after all. She brought the letters to Alexander with a heavy heart, knowing the news would trouble him deeply, understanding all too well the particular sting of discovering betrayal from someone once trusted completely. He read through the correspondence in silence, his expression darkening with each page, and when he finally looked up, Eleanor saw not anger but a quiet, weary sadness. "I trusted him," he said simply. "For years I trusted him with matters far more delicate than mere translation." "You could not have known," Eleanor said gently, taking his hand. "Deception like this is rarely visible until someone finally thinks to look closely enough." Together they confronted Price directly, laying the evidence before him without accusation, simply asking for the truth. To his credit, the man did not deny it, offering instead a weary confession of financial desperation and poor judgment from years past, long since regretted, though never fully atoned for. Alexander, torn between old loyalty and necessary caution, ultimately declined to reinstate him, though he offered a modest settlement to help the man start honestly elsewhere, a mercy Eleanor privately thought showed more character than punishment ever could have. The incident, though troubling, ultimately strengthened something between them, rather than weakening it. Where once Alexander might have hesitated, doubted, second-guessed himself into paralysis the way he had during that painful confrontation months before their wedding, he now turned to Eleanor immediately, trusting her judgment completely, valuing her insight as an equal partner rather than merely a skilled employee. The lesson of Lord Falworth's betrayal, and now this quieter revelation about Price, had taught him something valuable about the difference between blind trust and earned trust, and about how thoroughly Eleanor had proven herself worthy of the latter, again and again, without fail. Word of Eleanor's skill continued spreading beyond the county's borders as the months passed. She began receiving invitations to advise other households on diplomatic matters, requests for her assistance in drafting delicate correspondence between English families and foreign business interests. She accepted only a few of these opportunities, careful to preserve her time and energy for the growing responsibilities of the estate itself. but each invitation served as another quiet reminder of how far she had traveled from that silent corner of the drawing room where no one had once thought to look twice at her. Margaret and William Hartwell, for their part, made several attempts over the following year to re-establish contact, their letters growing increasingly warm as Eleanor's new status became impossible to ignore within their social circles. Eleanor read each letter carefully, weighing forgiveness against the memory of 6 years spent unpaid and unseen, and ultimately chose a measured, careful distance, polite but firm, neither cruel nor overly forgiving. She sent modest gifts on family occasions, maintained cordial correspondence with her cousin Beatrice, who had always shown her genuine kindness, but declined every invitation to renew closer ties with the aunt and uncle who had valued her only for what she could provide. "You are kinder to them than I would be," Alexander observed one evening, watching her seal a polite reply to one of Margaret's increasingly frequent letters. "Kindness costs me nothing now," Eleanor said simply. "I no longer need their approval to feel whole. That alone makes forgiveness far easier to offer than it once might have been." It was during the second winter of their marriage that the greatest test of Eleanor's diplomatic skill arrived, though this time the stakes were more personal than any negotiation she had previously navigated. Minister Voss wrote with troubling news, a political shift within his own government threatening to unravel the very trade agreement Eleanor had worked so hard to secure that first tense evening. A faction opposed to foreign partnerships had gained influence, and unless the agreement could be renegotiated quickly, with careful attention to newly sensitive political concerns, the entire arrangement risked collapsing entirely, threatening not just the tenant families who depended upon it, but the broader relationship between the two nations that had grown steadily stronger over the past year. Alexander wished to travel immediately to address the matter in person, but urgent estate business tied him to England for at least a fortnight, a delay that could prove disastrous given the shifting political winds abroad. After much careful discussion, they arrived at a decision that would have seemed impossible only a year before. Eleanor would travel in his stead, representing the estate's interests directly, armed with full authority to negotiate on Alexander's behalf. It was, in every sense, the fulfillment of the very dream she had confessed to him in the gardens all those months ago, the dream of traveling, of representing English interests abroad exactly as her father once had, except now she traveled not as an assistant hidden in someone else's shadow, but as a trusted envoy in her own right, sent forth with her husband's complete confidence. The journey proved long and occasionally difficult, but Eleanor navigated the political complexities of Minister Voss's government with the same careful precision she had once applied to that very first tense negotiation. She listened more than she spoke, noticed the subtle currents of resistance and support within the unfamiliar political landscape, and slowly, patiently, rebuilt the fragile trust necessary to preserve the agreement. Minister Voss, delighted to see her again and deeply impressed by the authority Alexander had entrusted to her, worked tirelessly alongside her to counter the opposition's arguments, ultimately securing the agreement's survival through a compromise that satisfied both the political factions at home and the practical needs of the English estate depending upon it. She returned home 3 weeks later to find Alexander waiting for her at the very same drawing room window where he had once stood watching Minister Voss's carriage disappear into the night, that first crisis finally resolved. He crossed the room the moment she entered, pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of how completely he had missed her, how proud he was of everything she had accomplished in his absence. "The tenant families will have their winter secured," Eleanor said, still breathless from the journey, still glowing with the particular satisfaction of work well done. "The agreement holds, stronger now than before, I think, having survived a true test rather than simply being signed in a moment of relief." "You did that," Alexander said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "entirely on your own, thousands of miles from home, facing political complexities I could not have navigated half so well myself." "We did that," Eleanor corrected gently, "together, the way we have done everything since that very first night." Years later, when their own children grew old enough to ask about how their parents had first met, Eleanor would tell the story simply, without embellishment, exactly as it had happened. A sick translator, a tense negotiation. A quiet woman standing unnoticed in the corner of a crowded room, who had finally, after years of careful invisibility, chosen to speak. She never described herself as having been rescued, though many who heard the story assumed that must be its shape, a poor companion elevated by a generous duke's kindness. Eleanor always corrected this gently but firmly whenever she heard it repeated that way. She had not been rescued. She had simply, finally, been seen, by a man wise enough to recognize what had been sitting quietly in plain sight all along, waiting patiently for someone to finally notice that the woman in the corner had never actually been small at all. She had simply been waiting, all those years, for the world to catch up to everything she had always known herself to be. And once the world finally did catch up, Eleanor Hartwell, now Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess in her own right, and diplomat in every sense that mattered, never once allowed herself to disappear into a quiet corner again. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the household had settled and the fires burned low, Alexander would find her at the study window, watching the drive the way he once had, and he would ask what she was thinking. She always gave him the same honest answer. She was thinking of the girl who once sat silent through countless gatherings, translating every word spoken around her, and speaking none of her own, and how far that girl had traveled to become the woman standing beside him now. Not because a duke had chosen her, though she was endlessly grateful he had, but because she had finally chosen herself first, on a single ordinary evening when the room needed a voice and she decided, at last, to be the one to give it. That choice, more than any title or agreement or carefully translated letter, remained the truest measure of everything she had built, a life no longer spent waiting in corners for someone else to notice her worth, but one lived fully, openly, in 7 languages and one unwavering voice, finally and completely her own.